Right now, you probably have money somewhere on you. A card in your wallet, a number on your phone screen, maybe some coins rattling around in a pocket you forgot about. You've been using money your entire life without once questioning whether it actually makes sense. And here's the thing. For most of human history, it didn't exist. Not just it was rare, it didn't exist at all. For roughly 95% of the time humans have walked the earth, there was no such thing as money. And when people finally invented it, the first versions were so strange, so fragile, and so badly designed that they nearly collapsed before anyone figured out how to make them work. The story of how money became real involves giant stones, collapsed governments, borrowed grain, and a problem that took thousands of years to solve. And the answer to why money works at all might be the most unsettling thing you hear today. Let's start with what money actually is. Not what it looks like, what it does.
Money is a tool that solves one problem. How do you trade with someone when you don't want what they're selling? That's it. That's the whole job. If you have chickens and you need a pair of sandals, but the sandal maker doesn't want chickens, you have a problem. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants. Both people in a trade need to want exactly what the other person has at exactly the same time. In a small village where everyone knows each other, you can solve this with memory and reputation. You help your neighbor fix his roof today, and he owes you something later. That works for about 150 people, maybe 200. But the moment you try to trade with a stranger, someone you've never met, from a village you've never seen, the whole system breaks. You need something else. For a long time, historians taught that the solution was barter. First came barter, then money. It's a clean story. It's in almost every economics textbook ever written. It's also almost certainly wrong. In 1985, anthropologist David Graeber spent years combing through historical and anthropological records looking for evidence of barter economies, large societies that traded using direct exchange before money existed. He couldn't find one. Not a single documented example of a society that functioned primarily on barter before developing some form of credit or currency. What he found instead was something far stranger. The oldest economies weren't barter systems. They were debt systems. Before money, people kept track of who owed what to whom. The first currencies weren't objects people exchanged. They were records, marks on clay, knots in rope, notches in wood that said, this person owes this amount. The oldest financial records ever found aren't receipts for traded goods. They're IOUs. In other words, credit came before cash. Debt is older than money. Let that sit for a second.
So when physical currency finally appeared, what did it look like? Not what you'd expect. Some of the earliest known currencies weren't metals or gems. They were things like grain, cattle, shells, and in one of the most bizarre cases in economic history, giant circular stones. On the island of Yap in the Pacific, people used enormous limestone discs as currency. Some of these stones were 12 feet across. You couldn't carry them. You couldn't move most of them at all. When a stone changed ownership, the stone didn't move. Everyone in the community simply knew it now belonged to someone else. The value existed entirely in shared understanding, not in the object.
One famous stone sank to the bottom of the ocean during transport. The people of Yap kept using it as currency anyway. They all agreed it still existed, still had value, even though no one would ever see it again. This sounds ridiculous, but here's the thing. It worked for centuries. Because value was never really in the object. It was always in the agreement. But agreements are fragile. and that's where the first collapses happened. Early commodity currencies, grain, livestock, shells, ran into a problem that no one had fully anticipated. They rotted. They died. They washed away. If your currency is grain and your granary floods, your savings are gone overnight. If your currency is cattle and disease moves through the region, an entire community's wealth can disappear in weeks. In ancient Mesopotamia, where grain was one of the primary units of account, records from around 2000 BCE show repeated instances of debt crises. Not because people were dishonest, but because the underlying commodity that backed the debt kept failing.
Farmers borrowed grain to plant a crop. A drought came. The crop failed. The grain they owed no longer existed anywhere. The debt remained. The grain didn't. And with no way to pay, entire farming communities collapsed into what we'd now call default. It happened over and over again. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal texts ever found, contains specific laws about debt forgiveness for farmers who lost crops to natural disaster. The problem was so common that ancient Babylonian kings periodically declared total debt cancellations, called clean slates, to stop their economies from seizing up entirely. Money existed, and economies were already failing because of it. So what actually fixed it? The answer came from a place you might not expect: government control. The first standardized metal coins appeared in Lydia, a kingdom in what is now Western Turkey, around 600 BCE.
Before Lydia, metals were used as currency, but in crude, inconsistent form. Lumps of silver, uneven pieces of gold. Every transaction required weighing the metal to know how much it was actually worth. The Lydians did something simple but transformative. They stamped the coins. The stamp, a guaranteed mark from the state, meant the weight and purity were certified. You didn't have to trust the stranger you were trading with. You trusted the stamp. And because everyone trusted the stamp, the coin worked everywhere. The historian Herodotus credited the Lydians as the first people to use gold and silver coins in retail trade. Within a generation, the idea spread across Greece, Persia, and India. Within 2 centuries, most of the known world was using stamped metal currency. Not because metal was magical, because the stamp was a promise backed by power. Money stopped being a commodity and became a guarantee. But here's the part that matters. The guarantee was only as good as whoever was making it, which is exactly the problem we still have today. Every time a government collapsed in the ancient world, its currency collapsed with it. The Roman denarius held steady for centuries, until emperors started shaving silver off the edges and replacing it with cheaper metal. Within decades of the debasement beginning, prices across the Roman Empire spiked. Merchants knew the coins were weaker. They charged more of them. That's inflation. Same mechanism, same cause, happening right now in every economy on Earth. When you hear that a central bank is printing money, that's the modern version of shaving the denarius. More units, same underlying value, each one worth a little less. The specific technology changes, the fragility doesn't. And then there's crypto, the latest attempt to solve the oldest problem in money's history. How do you create a currency that people trust, but that doesn't depend on any single government's promise to keep it honest? It's a genuinely new answer, but it's the same ancient question. Here's what all of this actually means. Money is not a thing. It never was. It's a story, a shared agreement that a particular object, number, or record has value because everyone involved agrees that it does. The yapstone that sank to the ocean floor was still
Worth something because the community decided it was. The Lydian coin was worth something because the king's stamp said so, and people believed the king. Your bank balance is worth something because millions of people collectively behave as if it is, and because the government behind it has enough credibility to maintain that belief. The moment the belief breaks, in a currency crisis, a bank run, a hyperinflation, the money stops working. Not because the physical coins disappeared, because the story stopped being believed. Humans invented money roughly 5,000 years ago. They've been arguing about how to keep it from falling apart ever since.
And the next time you tap your card on a reader and watch a number change on a screen, remember, you're not exchanging value. You're participating in an agreement, one that only works as long as enough people decide it does.